Inspired by the life of the savvy and ambitious Colombian businesswoman Griselda Blanco comes a new Netflix original limited series. Griselda tells the story of a devoted mother who, with her lethal blend of charm and relentless savagery, creates one of the most powerful cartels in history. Witness Sofia Vergara's captivating transformation into the godmother of the underworld. Griselda, streaming January 25th, only on Netflix.
I'm Mo Rocca, and I'm excited to announce Season 4 of my podcast, Mobituaries. I've got a whole new bunch of stories to share with you about the most fascinating people and things who are no longer with us. From famous figures who died on the very same day, to the things I wish would die, like buffets. All that and much more. Listen to Mobituaries with Mo Rocca wherever you get your podcasts.
TaxAct can think of a million things more fun than filing taxes. TaxAct is going to name some now. Sitting in traffic. Folding a fitted bedsheet. Listening to your coworker talk about his fantasy team. Digging a hole. Digging an even larger hole next to that original hole. Unfortunately, TaxAct's filing software can't make taxes fun. But TaxAct can help you get them done. TaxAct. Let's get them over with.
I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Alex Hall, and this is Disorder,
a podcast where we try, but don't always succeed, to find order in our mad world.
And this week, we're going to be talking about the EU, sometimes described as an economic giant but a political dwarf, the world's largest trading bloc, but an ineffective military and security player, or one that certainly punches below its weight. But is that an entirely fair description? It is, of course, true that the EU doesn't have its own army. It doesn't have hordes of tanks, fighter planes, and battleships at its disposal. But it does have other tools for advancing its geopolitical goals. Above all, its economic clout, the amount of aid it gives, and the trade leverage it has. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking a little bit more about how does the EU use that economic muscle for political ends? How does it promote better adherence to human rights, democracy, and environmental standards? We're going to look at how the EU is trying to navigate new challenges such as the rise of China and what some see as an increasing isolationist and protectionist sentiment in the US. And finally, most spicily, we're going to get a little bit of an insider's take on what went wrong over Brexit. Stay tuned. So Jason, we have a lot of meaty ground to cover today. I have to confess, I'm a little bit of a EU nerd myself. I like talking about this issue. I've worked as a national of the EU and I've worked with the EU. But since, as a result of Brexit, neither you nor I are nationals or residents of the EU anymore, I'm going to let you kick off with the opening thought. When you think about the EU, how do you see it? Is it fair to describe it as an economic giant but political pygmy?
I wish it wasn't the case, but that's actually quite an apt way of putting it, Alex. The EU is not only an economic giant, but it's a regulatory and soft power giant. What they've figured out is how to coordinate and negotiate and leverage cultural and soft power influence. And those are the exact skills that will be needed, I want to point out. Those are the skills that will be needed to solve the primary issues of the enduring disorder around climate, tax policy, corruption, migration. But then there's this paradox, which is that why is it that the EU can't get their house in order enough? Because they're the ones who have the ability to solve these issues, but they don't. And this is because the EU's superpower of trade and of coordination and of soft power doesn't work in domains when the member states are divided or have different interests. Italy is much more worried about migrants than, say, Spain, because the migrants end up in Italy and not Spain. So maybe the problem with the EU is there isn't a way to deal with non-consensus issues. And I want to say, Alex, you can't out-EU me. I am the biggest non-EU born Romaniac nutcase that I have ever met. Being a part of global supranational coordination institutions is what I most care about in global politics. I see no solutions to any of our problems without EU-like institutions. So if the EU fails, we're all fucked.
Wow. Well, you're more of an enthusiast about the EU than I am, actually. I think it's a misconception to think I'm this mad, crazy Romaniac. I'm not. I don't think the EU is the source of the world's solutions. My issue with Brexit is I never thought the EU was the source of the UK's problems, and therefore leaving it wasn't the solution to the UK's problems. So I see the EU as a bit of a curate's egg. It's good in parts. It's a little bit of a broad brush distinction, but I would sort of distinguish between its internal policies and its external policies. On the internal side, I think the EU has done very well, and that's not least been because they've surrendered competences to the Commission, and the Commission has the power to negotiate all these agreements, and they have qualified majority voting. They've been willing to surrender a little bit of say for the collective good. I think where the EU is weaker and where this sense of it being less effective on the international stage is on the external element, it's foreign policy, because there it's still governed by unanimity. And so it makes decision-making a lot harder, it makes it slower, and when the EU has reached a decision, it's much harder for it to shift from that position and adapt to changing circumstances. So you get this phenomenon of the lowest common denominator, and a country like Hungary can use its veto to block action. When we had Kurt Volker on the show talking about NATO, he described the requirement for consensus as a strength in NATO, that when NATO did actually reach a decision, because every single member of NATO had agreed to that decision, it had a strength. And so although I think this unanimity and consensus requirement makes EU decision-making on foreign policy slow, I think there are risks in abandoning it.
Well, a lot of interesting points there. I agree with a lot of the content, Alex, but I'm not sure the curate's analogy resonates with me. It feels a bit harsh. What I understand a curate's egg to mean is that those areas where the EU is spoiled inherently taint the areas that are unspoiled. But I want to call a spade a spade. The EU is very, 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 very poor at politics. I believe that what Macron said about NATO, i.e. NATO is brain dead, does not apply at all to NATO, but it does apply to the EU. And I'm going to tell a story that illustrates this. While I was pretending to do my PhD at Cambridge and really setting up my consulting company, I remember taking a spring break, as one does, in Libya. And while I was there, I was invited to brief the EU ambassador, and she's allowed me to tell this story. I tell it in my book. Her name was Natalia Apostolova. She was a Bulgarian diplomat. She's asking me, who matters in Misrata? What are the militiamen I should talk to? And I said, well, in Misrata, you've got to talk to Bashara, and you've got to talk to Fauzi Abu Al. And she's writing down these names. And her secretary is like, oh, can you help us get the phone numbers of these people? And I'm like, no, I'm a graduate student. Can't you ask the British or the Italian governments who have deep intelligence operations and they're talking every week? Can't he give you the phone number of him? And she looks me straight in the face and she says, the Italians or the British would never share such sensitive intelligence with us. And I'm like the phone number of a minister? And then it occurred to me, the EU does not get the weekly updates or the situation reports of the member country embassies. They didn't have the ability to draw on the Libya knowledge of the Italians. So this means that the EU is brain dead in any context where the member states don't want to share information about what their policy is.
Yeah, but Okay, so I have two different experiences. When I was posted to Bogota in Colombia, I agree the EU's approach was harder to coordinate. The Spanish considered this their backyard, so they were quite protective of their insider knowledge and connections and took a little bit of pride and were a little bit resistant to sort of other countries suggesting how we ought to deal with Colombia. But I had a completely different example to yours in Georgia. We used to have monthly EU heads of mission meetings, and the EU ambassadors were generally very good, and we tended to pool our knowledge. It worked really well.
That can be easily explained is that Georgia is a country that the EU has an association agreement with and is willing to try to help. Yes, the Germans may want a slower pathway to Georgian membership in NATO, but all EU member states essentially want to be helping Georgia. And therefore, they coordinate and work well. Whereas in Libya, there isn't any kind of consensus about what we should be doing or who we should be supporting. So that the EU as a mechanism doesn't work in those situations.
But then I think it's unfair to expect too much of the EU. It's a little bit like the UN. The UN is only as good as its members, and the Security Council becomes gridlocked whenever a core interest of the Chinese, the Russian, or the Americans is at play. So the same is true of the EU. It doesn't mean the EU is completely flawed. It means we need to recognize there are always going to be limitations in what it can do.
100%. And I'm the one who doesn't believe the EU is fundamentally flawed. I'm all about the EU. What I want to toss out is other things that we learned about the EU, Alex. Like, I was surprised during the pandemic, although I'm not so much looking back because it's a kind of enduring disorder thematic issue, which is that when the pandemic started happening in, say, March 2020, when northern Italy, particularly the area around Milan, was the epicenter of the global pandemic, Germany closed the borders and wouldn't let Italians in. And it also wouldn't let its spare ICU capacity be used by Italy. That kind of shocked me because it points out that the things that the EU is supposed to do can be at any moment without any kind of treaty negotiation or whatever revoked. And I didn't realize that that might happen.
Yeah, so there are opt-outs for critical national emergencies. But COVID put immense strain around the globe in the race for vaccinations, for example. And yet in the EU, there were countries like Germany that had advanced stocks, and they didn't use them all on Germans first. They waited, and there was a rollout across the EU where every country got the same percentage per capita of vaccines. There were examples of individual selfishness, but there were also examples of quite impressive collective action. And in the end, the EU rollout of vaccines ended up being better than in the UK, which was very keen selfishly to hoard them to ourselves first.
Yes, this gets at the idea of the EU having a better kind of philosophical underpinning. And I think that it certainly has this when it comes to dealing with trade than the US or the UK. A lot of US and UK neo-populism is about winning when your opponent loses. Trump wants to win a trade war with China. And this has pinned Biden into having to do more made in America. You know, we're going to win and the others are going to lose. And like very 19th century, not at all the way trade actually works. But the EU is just philosophically more advanced than this. So they understand about winning together and they can negotiate better trade deals with better environmental carve-outs and better labor protections just because they get it and they philosophically have a populace who gets it.
Jason, that's a good point about the negotiating skills of the EU and whether it has a better philosophical understanding and ability to achieve agreements than the US does. But I think to help us understand these issues really well, we need to talk to an actual trade policy expert. So I'm really delighted that we're joined today by John Clarke, who has just retired after working for 30 years as a high-level trade expert and negotiator for the European Union. Since John and I are both British, and he was working in the EU while I was working in the UK side, we obviously couldn't resist having a little bit of a chat about what happened during Brexit. And we're going to come to that during the interview. But I began our conversation by asking him, how did he come to be working for the EU in the first place?
In 1973, when I was a 15-year-old living in Huddersfield in Yorkshire, and my dad broke into my bedroom in the morning and said, "We joined the EEC."
Yay!
I never imagined that decades later I'd be actually a senior official for the European Union. I mean, what happened was I was working for Hong Kong at the time and negotiating with the EU, and I was very impressed by the quality of their negotiators, and I thought, I'd like to be part of this team. So I joined the EU on that basis. I also love Belgian beer, the next best thing to Tetley Bitter, and I've never looked back. 60 agreements, and it's been a lot of fun, and I've never had to make any kind of moral compromise, which I'm very happy about. I've always been able to believe in what I'm doing.
Okay, so what are the ingredients for a successful negotiator? What does a good negotiator have and do?
Well, I have a kind of baker's dozen of lessons that I think are really, really fundamental. One, never tell a lie. It'll come back to bite you. Second, respect the other partner. Don't underestimate them ever. Every other country is fighting for their own interests, and you have to be wary. And I've seen several occasions where the other side has played some very, very dirty tricks. In the wine agreement negotiated with the USA, they stole our negotiating dossiers from the room.
They literally stole them?
And copied them. They took them away. Wow. You finish the morning's work, and you say, "Can we leave our stuff in the room? Is it safe?" "Yeah, sure, no problem, lock it up." We found that they were actually photocopying it all, yeah? Another occasion, I'm not going to tell you who did this, a negotiation with Brazil. The minister noted that when the Brazilians left the room, the Brazilian side had left their negotiating file on the table. And he said to his head of cabinet, "Get it, go and copy it quickly." The cabinet guy said, "I can't do that, that's unethical, completely unethical." So what happened, the commissioner took the thing himself, put it down his trousers, and walked out of the room and went to the Xerox and copied himself, yeah? Which gives a new meaning to the briefs, I would say, yeah? He had the briefs in his briefs. Third, be flexible and creative, use humor, use culture to keep the tone positive. Fourth, never get angry unless it's planned in advance. Negotiate with, not against the other partner. Recognize that it has to be mutually beneficial, not a winner-takes-all approach, and not the Trump approach. Keep your constituencies on side. Consult them all along the way so you have trust and there are no surprises at the end. Master the detail. Have a good intelligence network in the other country so you know what's going on politically, etc. Know when to stop negotiating. Stay calm. Don't be in a hurry. Don't leave lots of loose ends after the main negotiation is over, because that leads to unraveling. And last of all, there's no single formula for a negotiation. Yeah.
Now, you said that you really admired EU trade negotiators. Are they the best in the world?
No, they're among the best. I think there are 4 or 5 countries who have really, really top-class negotiators. One is the Indians, 1.3 billion people. To get to the top of the pile there, you've got to be very, very smart. Yeah? So they're very good. New Zealand are brilliant. They pay their people very well, and they get the best people. The Brazilians are very interesting. I mean, I used to think the Brazilians were brilliant negotiators. I've changed my mind on that. They never know when to stop. They over-negotiate. They do tantrums. They walk out of the room. Yeah, the EU, we're among the best trade negotiators because we have strong legal competences, and we are, I think, fairly sincere and balanced and reasonable in our approach to trade negotiations. At least I tried to be.
Yeah.
You know who was the first ever negotiator, by the way? It was God. When Moses went up Mount Sinai to get the commandments, the tablets, so he went up there for 3 days and 3 nights, apparently, according to the Bible, and all the tribes of Israel were at the bottom of Mount Sinai waiting for the results, and Moses staggers down after 3 days, clutching the tablets, and he says, that was a bloody hard negotiation. God is a bloody good negotiator. This guy, stubborn as hell. Do you want the good news or the bad news? All the tribes said, Moses, you've done a great job with the commandments. Give us the good news. He said, well, the good news is I got God down from 19 to 10 commandments. And the voice pipes up, so what's the bad news? Adultery is still there among the 10.
Okay, I was going to come to Brexit later, but actually what you've just told me has triggered a whole series of thoughts for me. Now, the UK left the EU It has failed to reach a trade agreement with India. It has failed to reach a trade agreement with the US. It has signed a trade deal with New Zealand and Australia on terms that many now consider are highly unfavourable to British farmers. And it has signed a trade deal with the EU, which has thrown up a whole host of non-tariff barriers and made trade between the UK and the EU worse. So that's a pretty poor record of trade negotiations by the UK. Tell me, what went wrong with the UK? Why were they so unprepared for trade negotiations? And how have we got to this point?
Brexit basically dealt the UK very weak hand in any negotiations, yeah? And to negotiate with the EU, an agreement which is actually worse than what they had, nothing to be proud of, yeah? Secondly, the UK government had no experience of trade negotiations because it had been given to the EU to do for the last 30, 40 years. And of course, I think the biggest mistake was to regard the EU as the enemy and not the partner. You know, you negotiate with somebody, not against somebody. And that's something that the UK just did not get at the political level. The civil servants are fantastic in the UK. No complaint there. But the politicians, they saw the EU as almost like the enemy. That is a recipe for disaster. You've got to build up trust with the other side and basically sit down with them and say, look, we inherited this problem. How can we help each other to fix it?
Right.
And the UK did not do that.
So how did it feel for you when Brexit happened? How did it feel from your point of view? And was there any question about whether you were able to stay on working for the EU or did you have to leave? What happened?
I was in Montevideo the night of the referendum doing negotiations with Mercosur, with the South American bloc.
Okay.
And I was in my hotel room and watching TV, watching the first results. I saw Nigel Farage being very, very upset and unhappy. And I thought, okay, great.
As many of us do.
So I went to bed, thinking, okay, we'll be fine, yeah? And the next morning, woke up, put the TV on. We'd left the EU. We'd decided 52% out. I went down for breakfast, and my colleagues, both my team and also the Mercosur negotiators, they hugged me as if I'd had a major bereavement. They felt so sad. And I felt very sad as well, and still do. My job was questionable, but Jean-Claude Juncker, in his wisdom, is a very, very good guy, by the way.
Who was then president of the Commission.
You know, we leave our passports at the door, he said, you know, when we joined the EU, and we are European nationals, so he took a decision that we stay.
And one thing that really strikes me about those Brexit negotiations is the seamlessness of the European Parliament, the European Commission, the European Council, and all the member states of the EU being willing to trust the European Commission to represent them. What I observed on the British side is the politicians didn't trust the civil servants. The civil servants were in despair because their advice to politicians was ignored because it didn't comport with the ideological sort of beliefs of the politicians. And then there was huge infighting between the Department for Exiting the EU, DEXEU, and the Foreign Office, and Number 10. Of course, two other aspects that I think weakened the UK's hand in negotiating Brexit were, of course, that it was very much an English-centric negotiation. And there was a failure, really, to create a united position, taking into account the interests of Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And we sidelined stakeholders such as business. There was not a sufficient process of consulting business. So the UK never had a strong, united, clear position. Is that what it looked like? I mean, I'm just listening to you explaining that sense of solidarity.
A bit of exaggeration in what you say, but not very much. I think certainly this was a model case in how to negotiate well on the EU side. We consulted our stakeholders all along the way. We don't tell lies. We don't go around the backs of the negotiators. The UK, they thought they could nobble us by talking to France or Spain or Sweden. That doesn't work. You should never do that in negotiation. It very rarely works, yeah? And of course, the EU is actually very democratic. You know, we have a real separation of powers. We have elected member states who take the decisions. An elected parliament on trade issues also joins in taking decisions. I was a proud, unelected Brussels bureaucrat. That's the whole point of being a bureaucrat. You're not elected. You're implementing what your elected politicians tell you to do. And if you're lucky, you've got politicians who are good and honest and ethical.
We have an election coming up soon in the UK, sometime this year. If the polls are to be believed, it looks like potentially we have a different government, potentially a Labour-led government. And they have talked about wanting to address what they see as various flaws with the current deal between the EU and the UK. What scope, realistically, is there for Keir Starmer and his new government to renegotiate the trade and cooperation agreement with the EU? How much wriggle room is there? And is there any appetite on the EU side to make meaningful changes to this?
There is some scope for change. What's regrettable is that Starmer has upfront ruled out any kind of rejoining the single market or a customs union, both of which are completely feasible.
They are? You think the EU would be open to it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Provided it's done on good faith on the UK side, and we're in it for the duration, for the long term, yes. We have arrangements like that with Norway, with Switzerland, with many countries. So there are lots of options for the UK to integrate more with the European economy on trade without having to rejoin. That would be feasible, and I think the European Union would be very open to that.
Moving on from Brexit, just to help us understand, what are the type of agreements that the EU has in trade?
To be very simple, we have 4 kinds. We have one-way preferences, where we give complete access to the other country, mostly poor African countries, yeah? Second kind is free trade agreements, like with Japan, Canada, Vietnam, so 2-way access. Third kind is customs union, like we have with Turkey. And the fourth kind is kind of integration agreements with our neighbours, where not only do we dismantle duties, but they align to our regulations, so they become part of the single market. To put it in terms of going to the pub, the first kind, one-way preferences, it's on the house. I buy you as many drinks as you want. You don't have to buy me a drink. I'm paying. Second kind, FTAs. Okay, we'll go Dutch. We pay for our respective drinks. Third kind, customs union. We'll have the same drink. We'll buy each other's drinks, but we'll have the same drink. And the fourth kind, the integration agreements. Okay, we're going to have the same drink. We're going to have dinner together. And maybe, if I play my cards right, you'll come home to bed with me tonight.
Oh. What have been the EU's most successful trade deals to date, do you think?
Well, we're running out of road a little bit, but our free trade agreements with a lot of the world, perhaps our most obvious success in the last 10 years. I mean, half of our trade now, a bit more than half, is on preferential terms. And that's been quite successful. I mean, we basically, covered almost the whole world now, with the exception of, US, Russia, China, big omissions, but there are very good reasons for that. The other thing I would say about EU trade policy and successes, we've been using our trade agreements and negotiations for decades for political ends. So trade has been the EU's foreign policy, basically.
Okay.
We've used trade agreements to promote not only, exports of champagne and BMWs, but also our values, human rights, labor rights, environment, climate, biodiversity. And I think on that, we've been moderately successful, but we're running out of road now because a lot of countries, they don't want to negotiate trade agreements with all of this heavy environmental and human rights baggage.
Is there also an issue that the rise of China is giving countries an alternate model? Like, for example, the Latin American countries, more and more of their trade is with Asia and especially China. So a trade deal with us is slightly less valuable to them than before. Is that also a phenomenon, or is it just that the EU is demanding too much?
I think it's both. We are demanding a bit too much. But when it comes to China and all of that, the Latin Americans, they need the Chinese market. Yeah, so that's a very simple equation for them. I think Australia is a more interesting example. Yeah, I mean, we tried to finish an agreement with Australia a few weeks ago. It failed.
Why did it fail?
Well, I think 2 reasons, or maybe 3 reasons. One reason, we didn't offer enough on beef and lamb.
Uh-huh.
I had a boss, a French guy, wonderful guy, and he used to say to me, Jean, it's not about development, it's not about sustainability, it's about money, Jean, money. And they are, I'm afraid. Trade negotiations are really, really cutthroat. And I think we failed because we didn't give enough beef and lamb to Australia. Second reason was that the Australian Prime Minister got out of bed the wrong way on the morning of the final negotiations, and said to his trade minister, and shocked him, don't do a deal with the EU. So everybody was in a state of shock. But the third reason, I think, and that comes back to China, is that the Australians, they looked at the economic and trade landscape. They did a great deal with the UK, which was half of the EU market pre-Brexit. Right. So they don't need the EU as much. They've mended their bridges with China. And so the Chinese market is their beckoning, massive market. They don't need the EU so much, yeah?
What can we see between the EU and the US? You have elections for the European Parliament, which on current trends might go in a more populist direction and protectionist direction. And you see potentially the same thing happening across the Atlantic in the US. And there's been quite a lot of concern that the US and the EU, despite having created a new Trade and Technology Council to try and iron out some of their trade disputes, there is a slight worry that we may be diverging when it's in our mutual interest to converge as much as possible against the threat of China. So what are the trends in the US and the EU?
First of all, I don't think that the EU trade and economic policy is going to change very much, because we have so many checks and balances. Even a slightly more right-wing European Parliament is not going to change the price of fish.
What if they elect a different kind of European Commission to do the negotiating?
Well, they won't. There's no risk of that.
Okay.
Our trade policy is set out in the European treaties, so that is the kind of basic mandate. Yeah.
Okay.
Trump will maintain and slightly worsen what's already been a fairly negative policy on trade under the Democrats and Biden. We were a bit naive and optimistic, thinking that when Biden got in, trade policy would be great again in USA. Not the case. The Democrats are not particularly pro-trade. Trump is not particularly pro-trade. So I think we'll see a continuation of this domestic production, trying to insulate the USA from dependency on China. I think it will fail. It needs China, and China needs the US. For me, the worry is that what we have to be aware of is the US trying to get us into their bed against China. And I think the EU, we have a different approach to China. We should have a different policy. We need to have dialogue, cooperation with China. They're not going to go away, like it or not. It's in our interests, in the world's interests, that the EU and China maintain a healthy trade and economic relationship.
I mean, didn't the EU get itself burned by thinking that developing trade and economic relations with Russia wouldn't create any security blowback? And then after Russia invaded Ukraine, we all discovered that the EU, all of us, were far too dependent on Russian oil and gas. So you're saying that you don't think the EU should go down that route with China, but isn't there a risk we could make the same mistake?
Our economies are largely complementary and very, very interdependent in a global economy with multinational investments. But there may be a case for trying to prevent certain technologies getting into the wrong hands. Perhaps even more important, ensuring that key sectors in Europe are not taken hostage by Chinese investment.
Right. So limiting exposure.
Limiting exposure, yeah. And I think we've done that already in the EU. We have new regulations on screening inward investment. Do we accept that this Saudi company or this Chinese company or this whatever company can buy 40% of the wheat production in Europe? Yeah, that kind of thing. But it's also now we're doing it in the other direction. Do we allow this German company to set up and invest in China in a joint venture and then transfer lots of very, very sensitive technology into China or Russia or other places? But business is like water. It will find a way around every obstacle. It will trickle down, trickle through, find a channel. We have an embargo on importing Russian oil. Yeah. It was refined in the EU. What's happened? They export the oil to India.
Yes.
India refines it and then exports it back to the EU.
Right.
Russia suffers no loss. We suffer a loss because we don't get the added value of the refining in Europe, and India wins out.
So looking ahead, we've talked a little bit about what's coming up on the horizon in terms of elections. What are the big challenges for the EU in 2024 and beyond on the trade side?
So I think the first challenge is how we manage relations with Ukraine. We've opened our market completely to Ukrainian products. That's led to very big disruptions in Europe on wheat, poultry, sugar, protests, blockage by Polish and other farmers on the border. It's leading to a very big ebbing of sympathy for Ukraine, which is very, very disturbing politically. So we have to manage this very difficult situation. Second big challenge, how do we manage our relations with China and the USA? We need to balance our relations on trade and investment with both, manage the pressure on human rights issues with China. And the third thing is the sustainability agenda. How can we prosecute our net zero climate agenda through our trade agreements without too much pushback? Because Europe on its own cannot solve the climate problem. So it's going to be quite a tricky thing to manage in the next year.
After the break, how can we learn various things from the EU's negotiating prowess to help us order the disorder? So, Alex, I have a lot of takeaways from John's comments. I guess the first one, I have to lead with this, is how shocked I was to hear about the duplicity of the US and other negotiators who photocopied their partners' dossiers.
I'm slightly less shocked, I have to admit.
I know we do intelligence operations, and I obviously know that we tapped Merkel's phone, but that was because we thought we were going to get away with it. Do you know what I mean? So the crazy part is kind of how clumsy it is, because I'm the first to say that diplomacy and negotiations are a game, but it's what we call an iterative contest, just like in playing backgammon against an opponent every Tuesday. If you didn't pay him the first week, he's just not going to play you again, and therefore you hurt your own long-term earnings by cheating now. We're going to be doing trade with fill in the blank, Brazil, for generations or centuries. Why would we hurt our future credibility to gain such a minor advantage? I would almost say that this is a sin against future generations.
It's a little bit Keystone Cops, I admit.
We learned from Jonathan Powell that negotiating is both an art and a science. Also that it's a learned skill. So in hearing from John Clarke, I think it's important to point out that, for 4 decades, the UK didn't have any trade negotiators, and the EU had top-table global experience. So it can't be much of a surprise that the EU was able to advocate for their interests better than the UK in the Brexit negotiations. This makes me want to ask you, Alex, were there generalized negotiating courses in the Foreign Office, like in the 1990s? Did you ever get such a course? I mean, is there a repository of institutional knowledge on how to negotiate in Israel-Palestine, how to do a summit, how to do a trade agreement? Is there a dossier about how do we do one of these negotiations?
It's always like, if you're in on the inside, is there some secret knowledge? I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you here. No, we did not take training courses in negotiations. The astonishing thing about the training that I did as a Foreign Office, they have absolutely brilliant language training, and I learned to speak Thai fluently. I studied Hindi, Arabic, Spanish, and Georgian during my time in the Foreign Office, and they really pride themselves on their language expertise. The higher up the system you get, there's an enormous amount of training on management, leadership, communication, and then we learn specific skills related to a particular job. So if you're going to be a consular or a visa officer, you learn about consular and visa matters. But no, nothing on negotiations. And there were quite a few areas where I felt I was quite badly equipped as a diplomat. One of the most stupid ones was when I got appointed to be ambassador in Georgia. I got trained all these skills and leadership and managing my embassy and what to do in an emergency. Those were all quite good courses, but I had absolutely no idea what the protocol was for presenting your credentials. I didn't get any guidance on your first 10 days as an ambassador, what you were supposed to do. And I remember going to call on the president of Georgia to present my credentials. And I actually didn't have a clue what I was supposed to do. Was I supposed to bow? Was I supposed to say a form of words on behalf of Her Majesty? I humbly offer my, respect to Your Excellency. I didn't know any of that stuff. So the Foreign Office training is a bit weird.
What you're saying, Alex, is that no one ever explained to you how to be a plenipotentiary.
No, it was just considered to be innate, let alone a humble or an extraordinary plenipotentiary, because I believe in my ambassadorial scroll, it says that I am an extraordinary plenipotentiary.
I believe you were a very extraordinary plenipotentiary.
I was, and most excellent too.
And that's kind of what I would imagine, Alex, because it's the same at the State Department. They don't learn how to negotiate and they don't learn how to be ambassadors. And I'd just like to see if we could get like former negotiators together. Could they distill something? I'd like the Foreign Office to pay me one of these no bid 60 million PPE style contracts of how to negotiate better. And I'll make a dossier of 10 pages for them for 60 million, because we could use this with the Australians or New Zealand to, have like a better deal on lamb imports. And that's going to save back the 300 or 400 million right there. So it'll be worth their while to do this deal with me.
I'm just going to pull out the two themes for me from John's interview. I mean, of course, he gave some wonderful tips on how to be a good negotiator that mirror a lot of what we heard from Jonathan Powell and his experiences on the Northern Ireland negotiations. The two bits that I worry about with the EU is one, and John hinted at this, that I think the EU is at risk of going too far on its environmental, social, and governance agenda. I mean, it's hard to say these standards don't matter. I think they do, but I think the EU is running out of steam. And if the EU is not careful, it will risk losing trade agreements. And in fact, an agreement that was supposed to be negotiated with Mercosur, all of Latin America, collapsed literally just before the end of last year. And he talked about the one that fell apart with Australia. That's very dangerous because China can exploit that vacuum. My other issue that leapt out from his interview is I really worry about the EU and the US diverging on the trade agenda.
Yes.
And he alluded to this point. It's not just Donald Trump. I mean, it's on the Democrat side as well. The Biden administration has also been tough to negotiate with on trade. And we have this issue of China, and we do need to de-risk. And I think the EU got incredibly burned on Russia. We don't want to end trade with China. We would, of course, our economies are intertwined and that provides a measure of stability, but we do need to limit our exposure. We cannot afford the EU and the US, that sort of rift growing.
It's a dangerous rift, and we have to prevent the EU-US rift from growing. And it's going to be difficult to do because we're seeing a rise in protectionism. And protectionism is a neo-populist phenomenon. As soon as you have a neo-populist in one administration, he says, oh, I'm going to block trade with X. Then X retaliates against Y. And it's like, well, we're going to block trade and raise our tariff barriers. And then Z says, well, we're raising our tariff barriers. It's the beggar thy neighbor phenomenon. And also it's really difficult once you've created a discourse, oh, we're getting screwed by the Chinese on trade, we need to buy American or whatever. So Biden has to largely absorb the Trumpian made in America ideology. And it's really difficult to roll them back because what we've done is we've given more legitimacy to European forms of trade populism. And I see European trade populism as something that we need to be really worried about, because we were talking in this episode about how good the EU is as a trade negotiator. And the fact is, with Geert Wilders coming into power and the Giorgia Meloni's and the Svenska Demokraten, I could see EU trade negotiating prowess simply stopped in its tracks, because once you have 3 or 4 more, Robert Fico in Slovakia, they're going to be like, I don't want to have free trade agreements. I want to promote made in Slovakia. And we don't even care if we're not going to be able to export our things. we just want to protect these, Slovak manufacturing or Dutch cheese jobs. And then the whole virtuous cycle is just cut off right there at the knees.
Absolutely. There is a dangerous populist trend. And so actually that's another point that we were chatting about with John, is whether elections across the EU coming up through 2024 will change the political calculation. And he thought, no, the Commission will stay. There's a very clear mandate. But all these agreements need to be ratified by parliaments. So I still think there's a danger.
I want to make an elitist counterpoint to what John has said, which is that trade policy is to me like invading Vietnam. It isn't something that the people should know about or be consulted about. Invading Vietnam was a mistake, not because the people were against it. It was because it was a mistake, and you needed Vietnam and South Asia experts to assess the domino theory. You know what I mean? And the question of trade policy and how many tons of lamb and how they should be taxed, it's not a matter for the people to decide. It's a matter for having the right, true experts who can understand and channel the national interests and get the best deal for your nation or trading bloc. And this pivots off of what John said. Yes, it's really important to think about the ways in which the EU has mismanaged the Ukrainian war implications on trade. I am all for letting the Ukrainians have free trade access to compensate for the ways in which their economy has been damaged, but you can't let Polish wheat farmers or, sunflower oil producers in other parts of Eastern Europe be harmed. Those industries which are harmed should simply be compensated directly, or they should get a benefit. Everyone should win-win. The Ukrainian farmer should win, and the Polish farmer needs to win, because otherwise they're going to create constituencies that don't want Ukraine to be further integrated into the EU. And we have to have expert policies to disentangle that and make winners out of the losers. What do you think, Alex?
I think you've made an absolutely brilliant point. And Ukraine is going to be the biggest geopolitical test case for the EU this year. Same with NATO summit. Is it going to offer Ukraine membership? The EU is inching closer. They've invited Ukraine and Moldova to start accession negotiations. But if we let Ukraine down and Putin is sitting there waiting it out and Trump gets returned to the White House, the geopolitical implications of this are just awful.
Oh, they're dire.
So going back to your point about the EU must not lose sight of the wood for the trees and not allow individual constituencies to derail the geopolitical necessity of supporting Ukraine. That's a wonderful point to end this episode. I think we're going to have to come back and do another episode on EU enlargement because it's massive. Jason, this has been a great episode to chat with you. I hope our listeners have enjoyed it. If you've liked today's episode and want to listen to more, please tap follow right now wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll be notified when every episode comes out.
Always great to order the disorder with you, Alex. You can read more about John Clarke and the great work he's done in trade negotiating in our show notes.
Our producer is George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern.
Thank you for listening, and hope your week is characterized by free and efficient trade and orderly negotiations.